And then you're saying, so the attempt to fill that gap is, for example, the turn to other disciplines, the law and economics, politics,
Exactly.
all those other disciplines.
Yes.
And you say, just like Chris's treatment of his patient, that's condemned to failure.
Yes.
You can't fill that gap.
Yes.
International law will still go out and look for fresh brains.
Yes.
So you cannot fill that failure. And then take us to the next step.
The next step is to acknowledge the gap for what it is. If we don't fill it up with fresh brains or other disciplines, we leave this gap much more plain for us to see. And what we discover, unfortunately, and that's why, as I said in Lacanian analysis, the patient is devastated because it's the last thing we want to discover. And that's why most people don't go through it, or disciplines, is that inner core, that gap, is absolutely ugly. You know, it's obscene, it's terrifying.
It is absolutely ugly, you say.
Ugly.
Obscene, terrifying.
Obscene, terrifying, evil. It's something that we don't want to acknowledge exists. And therefore, in this paper, I give you the term estimate. And it's a term that was coined by Lacan. It's a beautiful neologism because what it refers to is something that is so incredibly intimate that we have excluded it, not on the outside, where we could just ignore it, but we have hidden it inside, where no one, not even us, would bother to look. So it's estimate, it's excluded inside, in the interior. And therefore, we spend our whole lives trying to look, trying to find it. Zizek, actually, who I refer to a lot in this paper and is my big influence at the moment, calls it the known unknowns. I don't know if people are familiar with Zizek's corrective to the Secretary of State's epistemological categories when he was during the Iraq War, when he was telling us about the known knowns and the unknown unknowns, and in a White House press conference about the weapons of mass destruction, the supposed weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Well, what Zizek points out is that in that press conference, what was not mentioned were the known unknowns, things that we know, or our unconscious knows them, but we don't know that we know them, and it takes the shattering impact of a trauma or a long analysis to discover them. Most of the time we avoid them.
Towards the end of your article, so you take us through these moves. We understand now the way you use the case as a metaphor, the attempt of international law to close that gap that at least becomes visible with the so-called death of God is unfulfillable. Mm-hmm. And then there's a kind of mixture between the discipline and the personal.
Yes.
Just let's finish we've kind of walked through the article. So for international law, in a way you just leave it with, it's futile to try and fill the gap in that way. You have to recognize what you call the estimate, but you do not describe the evil, horrible, terrifying of international law. That's actually left undescribed in the piece. And then it finishes almost with a personal statement.
That's it?
Yes. So
Okay.
you talk about the individual rather than international law, almost
Sure.
about yourself.
Really? I thought I gave two examples of the estimate, which international law does have and should have, and if it doesn't, should have something to say about and adjudicate about. But in fact, my argument is that international law, like all laws, come against the brick wall because they are faced with the estimate, and that is what I think we should focus on. And I give two examples, and I said that the estimate, because it's so ugly, we're very, very loath to acknowledge it, but we are only too ready to acknowledge it and point it at when we see it in another person or another discipline. And I give two examples. The first example, where we ascribe it to the other person, to the neighbor, as Lacan would say, is the example of the niqab wearing the hijab in public. And I give the example of French legislation recently, and there's talk in the United Kingdom of the same kind of legislation being brought in, where it bans the wearing of the niqab in public. Yes, and there's been now we know from international as well as domestic law and human rights discourse generally that we're supposed to tolerate the other, everyone's religious beliefs, everyone's dress, opinions. And France is supposed to have been at the forefront of this sort of so-called celebration of tolerance, multiculturalism since the Second World War. Nevertheless, when it comes to something that is so incredibly unfamiliar, what Lacan would call the estimate, even French so-called tolerant human rights discourse comes to an abrupt end. So I use that as an example of the estimate.
I'm not sure everybody would find that persuasive, because the reader will say, yes, that's what France did.
Yes.
That's not every country did that.
Yes.
There's a difference in the practice. Some countries accept, some countries don't. But that example doesn't say anything about the discipline of international law. It's just an example of a society which might correspond to the Lacanian analysis, etc., of not seeing the evil in themselves and then projecting it onto the other and all that. But by using that example, you have made no statement about the discipline of international law. It's not even part of the example.
I guess the argument will carry on, though. I've left it for international lawyers to pick it up, because what I am seeing, not just in the example in France, but in the UK and in Europe generally, and in other countries, is that the same lack of tolerance of the neighbor who doesn't look like us is not just in France. I mean, that's not an isolated example. Okay, in France, it's obvious, and that's why, but in the United Kingdom last summer, we had the Home Office saw no problem having vans, these big vans driving around the streets of London, and the advert said, if you are an immigrant, go home. Now, what I'm saying is that this kind of intolerance is found in countries everywhere. The illegal immigrant, the refugee, the homo sacer, as Agamben would call them. Now, what I'm saying is international law is not dealing with that at the moment. It's not dealing it at that level where it's not absorbing or acknowledging this problem that domestic applications of international law are not following. No? You think international law is... No. What is it doing about the fact that its refugee laws or its human rights laws are in individual countries being trampled upon?
I think our listeners, our viewers, might still have two objections. Factually, they might say, it depends. When, for example, the Swiss, again, banned the minarets, I think everybody in the international interpretative community, legal community, would say that's in violation of international law. It clearly is a violation on grounds of discrimination, etc., etc. And for these examples, there's a rich legal discourse where international law actually does condemn these things. But that's, at a more profound level, one might argue, the dispute is not that our societies can or are be xenophobic, that we have this tendency to project our own weaknesses on the others, that we are fear of the others, but that it's not a statement about the discipline of international law. And you see, that might be one of the radical critiques of the article, is that the metaphor doesn't work. That when we come to think about it, and in a few minutes I'll ask you some more questions about it, you're saying something very important about society. And we get a Lacanian insight about how to understand certain bad, negative, evil aspects of our social behavior. But it's not readily apparent that you're making any statement about public international law. And that's independent of the fact whether international law puts it on its radar or not, and I think it does. I think a lot of these practices are very much on the radar of human rights law and international law, and very often condemn it and say that's violative, etc. But the point is, it's independent of that, because you're not describing something about the discipline of international law at all by just describing the social behavior. So that somehow, and that's, I would say, might be the more radical critique of the piece, the expectation that we can learn from the Chris-Lacan debate about the discipline of international law at the end doesn't work out, because the estimate that you are describing is not an estimate of international law at all. It's an estimate of our social behavior as society.
Well...
Don't be kind.
No, I don't think the response from a Lacanian would be that international lawyers, even at their most critical, even at their most radical, are not radical enough, because, as I explained at the beginning of this article, they are very good at dwelling in two out of three registers, in the sense that they know the law. They can understand the documents and treaties and resolutions, and they also, secondly, as you just pointed out, are very good at analyzing, criticizing, critiquing those manifestations of the law in the practice of states from the point of view of ideology, from the point of view of politics, from the point of view of everyday results that we see. Now, so you can have, all sorts of religions of critical international lawyers. What seems to be missing is the third dimension, which Lacan calls the third dimension of the real, which I don't have any answers apart from the examples and my exemplification of it through the estimate and the examples I gave. I don't have how to approach the real, but the point is because if there is one thing about the real, it's unrepresentable. It's beyond legislation. But what international lawyers including those who critique the ideology of international law and its politics and its manifestation in everyday practice, always, you could say, like with Chris's patient, they're still dwelling on the realm of the imaginary, on the realm of ideology, on the realm of the ego. And even if I'm a very politically active international lawyer, even if I'm forever fighting for all these causes, what I need to also be doing is analyzing my own engagement, my own, because if I think I'm being critical, if I think I'm being tolerant or open, maybe what I'm doing is solidifying my ego. That
Correct.
I'm saying I'm better than other discourses of law because I'm more just, I'm more about reconciliation, I'm more pragmatic, I'm more...
So let me maybe just clarify this. So that I find persuasive that when we look at the individual international lawyer, the activist, the radical, etc., one can make a strong case that even though he or she might believe they're doing the right thing, etc., they're in some way masking their own internal estimate. And that's where I thought what I hinted that at the end of the article, you again personalize it. And maybe we can leave it at that. I'm not sure that you make, and that's something to think about and maybe further develop, the relationship between that position of the individual international lawyer and the actual discipline of international law. Mm-hmm. That you're making a statement about the discipline. There's always this kind of tension between this is the discipline of international law and these are the actions of international lawyers utilizing the discipline. And there's a little bit of fuzziness there in the piece. And if I can maybe leave that because it's not necessarily to resolve it here. One might also question the beginning because the description of the malaise of international law, I'm sure some of our readers would immediately sympathize with this. You know, the international law that is insecure, that is looking for validation through other disciplines, etc. But others of our readers and authors will say, yeah, we're familiar with that approach, but we have a much more modest, self-limiting, positivist idea of international law. We don't think it's inadequate. We're not saying that it's adequate. We're just saying it is what it is and it can't be more than that. And I think, so some people will say, or might say, I don't recognize international law as the patient. Because when we started our conversation, we said international law is the patient who in some way recognizes the inadequacy. You gave the explanation, the death of God, that kind of certainty, which at least exposed the gap. But I think there might be others who, in a at least self-deceptive way, will say, no, international law is the limited enterprise it is. It can do what it can do. It can't do what it cannot do. It's not a substitute for politics. It's not a substitute for morality. We're not looking for international law to fill in all those gaps that result from the death of God. And therefore, they might critique the piece by saying, it's not that we don't recognize at the end of the day the estimate of the discipline. We don't even recognize international law as the parallel patient to Chris's patient.
On the fuzziness between individual international lawyers and the discipline, just very, very briefly, I'd say, the identity of the discipline is I mean, the discipline has no essence in itself except for the identity brought to it by individual practitioners, writers. So in some respects, the fuzziness has to be solidified through the conglomeration of all these fuzzy individuals, creating an identity which is but an identification of all of them together. On the second point about some international lawyers that might not recognize themselves there, well, in that case, the analysis will take longer. In that sense, for the critical international lawyers, the task for the analyst would be, I mean, the way you described it, and I do remember some international lawyers like that, both in Bristol and Cambridge, where they don't recognize any problem with the discipline.
Oh, they're not that they don't recognize any problem. There are lots of problems in the discipline, but not of the type that you premise,
yes,
which is international law has the aspiration
yes,
to this totalistic,
okay,
that it's both morality, that
yes,
it fills
yes,
the gap
yes,
of the
yes.
death of God.
Okay.
They say if you set it up like that,
Yes.
then the analysis works.
Yes, yes, yes.
But why should we expect law in general or even international law? Why should we expect international law, even law in general, to fill those kind of gaps?
Sure.
We don't look to law or to international law to give us all the answers to our moral dilemmas, to the human condition, etc. It's only because you set it up as searching for that, that you create the problem, the false solution, and then the correct Lacanian solution.
Obviously.
And this is not about denigrating. I remember some lawyers in Cambridge or Bristol who were like
that. Okay, no, this is a really good point, and I hadn't thought of it. And actually, there should have been another section in that article in that case, because we did start this conversation by pointing out that I identified with international law as a hysteric, and therefore identified with the early description of it as looking for something to fill the empty place and looking to other people to complete care. Now, the other kind of patient that analysts see on a regular basis, who I completely ignored in this article, and you are absolutely right to point out, I should have looked at, but I didn't because I don't identify with them, is the obsessive. The bottom line is both obsessive and hysterics are both neurotic, they both have a gap to fill. The hysteric, like me, like international law, or the international law I presented here, which is only one side, as you pointed out, looks to other people, other disciplines to complete care. Now, the other patient that I haven't given any room in this article, and you're absolutely right to point it out, is the obsessive, who, rather than looking for other people to complete care, busies themselves to such an extent to efface the gap. So there's no room for the gap ever to be visible. And you could say
that is
accumulating more and more rules, institutions, more and more decisions, more and more resolutions will make me forget that there's something missing. And that is the obsessive.
Even there, still if I want to probe a little bit, we would have the same problem or challenge in the transfer from the psychoanalytical patient to the international law, because if I relate to the answer you gave us a few minutes ago that we can't separate the international lawyer, the human subject, from the discipline and go with that, it's not that the second type of international lawyer does not recognize gaps, etc., that is not working under the weight of modernity, the so-called death of God, etc. It's just they're not thinking that international law is there to give the answers to that. So they might be hysterical in the sense that you described the first patient, if I'm focusing on the human subject, but where one might probe or push you a little bit back is to say you somehow believe that that gap they look to fulfill through the discipline of international law, through the professional dimension of their life, etc. And they would say, no, this gap is huge, it's burdensome, it's terrifying, but to imagine that one would expect international law to give all these answers, to be the one and all answer of morality, etc., that's where the challenge might be to the transfer from the psychoanalytical case to the patient we are now calling international law / international lawyers. So it's the answer through the obsessive might not be a real answer, because it might still be a hysterical patient, except the grand-père is not international law. We look for it elsewhere, and international law is... So you set it up in that way. I've diminished the importance of international law.
Yes. Well...
whereas you...
Yeah. Well, no. I think that's absolutely right, and it's actually... what I suggest at the end of the book would be the hallmark of an ethical subject. Maybe when I was immersed in international law, I hadn't reached that hallmark of the ethical subject where I acknowledge the limitations, my own limitations, and of the subjects, and of the disciplines. The gap is there, is unfillable. Maybe, like you say, I was hysterical trying to fill it. Now, I find this is the
Those
kind of a lesson. I mean, but...
No, I'm teasing, please.
No, but you see, I think, yeah, coming to terms with our own gap, our own estimate, it's the hallmark of an ethical subject. I don't think many of us get there until very late. I mean, it's almost, Lacan calls it as coming to terms with your own mortality. And it's something that most of us, most of our life, refuse to accept. In the unconscious life, Freud says, we all think we're immortal. We might, we know we're going to die, but unconsciously we think we're immortal. And so really consciously coming to terms with our own mortality is something that we strive to, and only comes very late. Now, in that case, the patient you describe would be the ideal ethical subject that has come to terms with its own limitations and doesn't look for it to be filled up.
Maybe, I'm not sure we're on the same page, because that patient might still be hysterical, except they wouldn't be looking to international law, etc. That's where... But I want to ask you, because there's one other area where I would be interested in your reaction. Mm-hmm. So, the paper is marvelous in its critical nuance, in its introspection, in its self-examination. And I don't just say this façon de parler. It's really a hallmark of the paper. What seems to be one huge lacuna, Lacan is God. Never questioned, never critiqued. What he says is the truth, is Torah from Sinai. Even the way you write it, if Lacan says it, it's dispositive of the issue. Okay. So there might be a gap. One way in which the gap is filled is to find Lacan. And
absolutely. To find Lacan lacking. That would be a step forward. Absolutely. You are absolutely right. To rewind a bit, I mean, yes, the hysterical subject might not be yet an ethical subject. I wanted to put something in her defense, though, and how that might help not just the subject, but the discipline generally. If there is one thing about my way of portraying international law as a hysteric, and myself included. If there's one thing that everyone, analysts generally, but philosophers as well, credit the hysterical subject for, is the fact that they won't rest. They will always, unlike the person, the international lawyer you just described, who says, I don't expect international law to do that, therefore, why are you expecting it? So the hysterical subject is always like, no, I want international law to do that as well, and that, and that, and that, and that. She's always provoking. And that's why, for Freud, obviously they invented hysterics, we invented psychoanalysis. Lacan credits them for inciting revolution because always challenging the master. The master cannot come back and say, I'm only international law, I can't do everything. No, the hysteric will say, why not? You should be able to do everything. She's always challenging him for not being masterful enough. And that is good for the discipline, is good for the master. Because the master, Lacan says, my master, Lacan says to the students in 1968 when they tried to disturb one of his lectures, and he turns around to them and says, you're only looking for a new master, But the good thing about hysterical subjects, including the students of 68, was that they were not happy with that master, and they keep challenging him until the master gets better. He'll never be the absolute master, because the absolute master is God. But at least we're stepping, she helps him, she provokes him into more knowledge, more discipline, and that's always a good thing. So, every good politician, philosopher, revolutionary, it was either a hysteric in him or her, or a hysteric pushing him or her. On the second point, you are absolutely right. I'm not challenging Lacan enough, or Zizek. And that's, for me, when I become the real ethical subject, that would be much better when I start challenging. I have been challenging Zizek, actually. I had an interview with him recently like this, and I did challenge him a bit. But Lacan, you're right. I'm not challenging him enough, if you said that. So you're absolutely right.
Maybe we should.
Good points.
I think anybody who's been listening or watching, if they have not read this piece, will be enticed and excited and hysterically rush and read it. And those who have read it, I want to believe that you will agree with me that this was interesting and illuminating, and one can understand the piece in a much more profound way than by simply reading it. I want to thank you very much.
Thank you all very much for your probing questions.